Welcome to the Refugee Portal Podcast, recorded at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. My name is Tarek.
And I'm Yusuf. The Refugee Portal Podcast interviews, shares, and learns from the stories of refugees, as well as the perspective of academics, humanitarian workers, members of government, and other stakeholders.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the interviewees and do not necessarily reflect those of the Refugee Portal Podcast or its hosts. All right, let's get right into it.
Today, we'll be speaking with our guest, Tony McAleer. Tony is a former organizer for the White Aryan Resistance. He served as a skinhead recruiter, and he was the proprietor of the Canadian Liberty Net, which was a computer-operated voice messaging center used to disseminate messages of hatred. As well, Tony was a manager for the racist rock band Odin's Law. But it was his love for his children that finally led Tony on a spiritual journey of personal transformation. And we're going to talk to him about his story, as well as his plan for building a better future through radical compassion. To give a bit of backdrop to today's global situation, in 2018, the last year's statistics are available in Canada, there were 1,798 reported hate crimes. In 2019, CBC gave a poll which found 57% of Canadians said that Canada should not be accepting more refugees. In the United States, hate-inspired physical assaults against people were up, according to the FBI. 61% of the 7,120 incidences that were classified as hate crimes were of a physically violent nature. In addition, the United States plans to admit a maximum of only 18,000 refugees in the fiscal year of 2020, down from a cap of 30,000 in the one that ended in September 30th, 2019. So under the new refugee admission ceiling set by the Trump administration, not even 20,000 refugees will be welcomed to America. This would be the lowest number of refugees resettled by the United States in a single year since 1980, when the Congress created the nation's refugee resettlement program. In Europe, far-right parties have been winning elections and forming governments across the continent. And although right-wing populism isn't a monolith, the movements and parties that belong to it share similar xenophobic, nationalistic traits, as well as a tendency towards authoritarianism, aggressive leadership, and an anti-elitist message. Given these trends of hate, violence, and xenophobia, what can be done to improve the situation? To help us find an answer, we're going to be speaking with our guest about that.
All right, welcome to the podcast, the Refugee Portal Podcast. Tony McAleer. I've known Tony for the last 2-3 years, and we've done a lot of work together in terms of interfaith, and I was intrigued. Rabbi Dan Muskovitz and the folks at Temple Shalom had a workshop, a speech by Tony called Life After Hate, and a former white supremacist journey from being radicalized and hating different religious groups and different races and ethnicity, and coming out of his journey on the other side. And in your Guardian article that kind of talked about your background, it was saying that people that have left these movements of far-right, alt-right, or white supremacists are called formers. And also I have your book as well, The Cure for Hate, and thecureforhate.com is where you can purchase the book, as well as on Amazon. So Tony, I'll let you kind of go into your background and just a bit of your journey, just to give the perspective as we dive in deeper on the discussion about how hate affects refugees and newcomers, and why it's growing in 2020, when we thought, this type of racial animus had kind of abated, but it's actually increasing all throughout Europe, all throughout North America. And so I'll turn it over to you to kind of talk about your background. What happened to you? How did you become radicalized? How did you join these movements? And then we can talk about current events.
Sure. And thank you for having me on the podcast. I grew up in the west side of Vancouver. I'm a Dunbar kid. I lived an affluent, a life of privilege. My father was a psychiatrist. Sometimes maybe that's the issue. No. I went to private schools, and I didn't suffer from any material want. And I think of who I was, and your listeners should do the same. Think of who you were when you came into the world, because nobody comes into the world a neo-Nazi or a white supremacist. And I think of who I was at the age of 4, and I was this bright, curious, stubborn, mischievous, a little defiant little guy who was open to the world. And then life happens to us, and we learn it's not always safe to be all of those things. And when I was 10, I walked in on my dad with another woman, and that really rocked my world and left me feeling shame, anger, betrayal. And I went from listening to The Clash and Elton John and the Queen to The Clash and the Sex Pistols, and started
punk rock.
Got it. Well, I could vibe with my anger, right? That's where I was at, and I was an AB student at the time that happened, and then by the next year I was a CD student, and the Vancouver College tried all the carrots in the world to get me to raise my grades, and when that didn't work, they got together with my parents, and my dad agreed that they should beat the grades into me. And if I didn't get A or B in major tests and assignments, I was marched into an office and hit on the rear end with a meter stick.
By the principal?
No, by the teacher.
By the teacher.
By the teacher.
And Vancouver College is one of the top private schools in British Columbia.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking the 70s. But I remember, every time, I had to go into that office and put my hands on the edge of the desk, and I don't know if you've ever heard this one. This is going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you.
I've heard it.
Yeah, I'm not sure who that's supposed to comfort, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't me. And in those times over, first time it was 2, then it was 4, then it was 6, then it was 8. Wax, never more than 8, but over and over and over again at those times in the office, I don't think I've ever felt more powerless than I did, over and over and over again. And I just want to be clear here. I don't blame anything on my childhood, right? Everything I did, I chose to do. But I share what happened in my childhood so you understand the lens through which I made those choices. And I have to be accountable for the choices that I made. And I'm not blaming anything on my childhood. I want to be clear about that. But have you ever gone to the grocery store when you're really hungry?
Yeah, and you buy a lot of stuff that you shouldn't buy.
Nobody makes you put that bag of chips or cookies in your... But you kind of it feels pretty good when you do, when you're really, really hungry. And I went out into the world emotionally hungry and made junk food choices. And, at least with junk food, you're just harming yourself. The choices I made harmed a lot of other people. And I ended up, in the punk scene and then the skinhead scene. I was born in England, came to Vancouver when I was 2. And what really drew me to the skinhead thing was it was very pro-British, right? So I was connecting to my immigrant identity, right? And because I'm an immigrant too,
and feeling different, feeling separate, feeling kind of
I struggled to fit in. I was I guess a little different as a kid, and I remember hanging out with these skinheads once I met them, and my parents were like, you've got all this opportunity in front of you. You got this, you go into private schools, you can go to any university you want. Why are you drawn to them? And I didn't know the answer. I just, it felt right at the time. But, thinking back on it, they had the one thing that I didn't have, and that was toughness. I was a pretty soft kid. I didn't get into a lot of fights at school. And I felt safe when I was with them. And I perceived that fear and notoriety as a false sense of power. And when I was with them, people were afraid of me. And my bullying survival skill was befriend the bully, become the bully. And I quickly learned how to exercise power through people. And I became the ringleader, and it went on from there. But when I think back to the times in that office, it was that opposite feeling. If that was complete powerlessness, when I was with these guys, I felt powerful, and I felt safe, and I got attention when I felt invisible, and acceptance when I felt unlovable, and a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning. a sense of joining something greater than myself, and this heroic struggle to save the white race from extinction. Some people were on the streets trying to save whales. We're trying to save the white race.
And obviously, you've heard the term white privilege, and
Yep.
white privilege meaning that some quarters or other cultures and races view that people that are white would have more economic capacity and ability and getting better jobs. I'll give you an example. We were at a technology conference recently, and an African-American gentleman who was there, he was developing this kind of program to identify employers. So he would send resumes out in the U.S., and in the U.S., in the resumes, you have to state your race, from what he was saying. And so whenever he would put African-American, he got 0 callbacks. As soon as he put white, 90% callbacks. So it was an interesting example. The same name, it was just a different ethnicity. So there's that sense with people that could be other religions, whether Muslims or people, immigrants from other countries that aren't white, that don't have white Anglo-Saxon names, may feel that they're marginalized or prejudiced because of their ethnicity and their color to get jobs and economic advancement. So what are your thoughts? Like, what was the white supremacist viewpoint on that? Was there a contradictory viewpoint to that?
Absolutely, and I just want to tell this little story, and it's actually in the documentary that we're showing at film festivals across the U.S. right now called Healing from Hate, Battle for the Soul of a Nation. And in it, there's this guy, Randy, going to a Richard Spencer speech at a university in Florida.
And Richard Spencer is?
He's the guy who coined the term alt-right. He's
okay.
He's the suit and tie. He was the one of the main guys behind Charlottesville.
Okay, got it. And you know how the term that they brought up, the Jews will not replace us. The Jews will not replace us. That kind of so many Jews are white as well, but obviously a different religion. So obviously there's that context. Okay, they're white, but now they have a different religion, and then it seemed like from the marching with the tiki torches, the young guys, kind of, it looked like a Hitler Youth rally.
Absolutely, and that chant started off as "You will not replace us," and then it morphed into "Jews will not replace us." And this comes back to the, if we'll just put the very important discussion about privilege to the side for a sec.
Sure.
The narrative is white genocide. The narrative is the manufacturing jobs in the Midwest are being replaced and phased out. The middle class is being replaced and phased out. That young white men with diversity programs in place have not very good chances to get jobs, and it goes back to I can't remember what century or when the book was. A French author wrote a book called The Great Replacement of people. So it's this white genocide narrative that in as far as the world is concerned, it's a shrinking percentage of the population, and there's immigration and all these different policies being put in place to undermine and replace white people. That's the narrative, and so they've painted it as an existential threat, through promotion of drugs, through the promotion of homosexuality, through the promotion of
race mixing,
and immigration, and that there's a demographic shift, and it really started to take hold in early 2000 when the U.S. Census predicted that whites will be a minority in the United States by 2050. All of a sudden, then it's like, they're trying to replace us. And these guys feed upon that fear narrative, and then now you've got this great crusade to save the white race from extinction, right?
And could that be also the existential threat? like, in my kind of interfaith work with the Muslim community, talking with the BC hate crimes, and they're saying a lot of hate crimes or a lot of mobilization is through social media. So a lot of emails go out, and some are kind of half true, some are a blatant kind of lies about a certain race or religion, and that's how a lot of it's being disseminated through social media, Facebook, and what have you. So shaping a certain narrative, because people are starting to become siloed to certain thought processes, and that's what the algorithms and all these social media platforms just keep feeding that narrative. And people that are like-minded, you can find so many groups online that fit that ideology, where people feel like they belong, they're accepted, and they're mobilized as this kind of supposedly persecuted group to kind of mobilize against other groups.
Right. The internet's awash with disinformation.
Yeah.
If you have three people with an opinion on something, only one can be right.
Yeah.
Right? So
sure.
But I think below that, what makes young white men vulnerable to the ideology, because the research shows it's not the ideology that draws people in, right? It's what comes with the ideology. It's that sense of brotherhood. It's that sense of purpose, sense of meaning, sense of community that comes with the ideology. And so how do young men become vulnerable to the ideology? And it's what I call, and talk about it in the book, toxic shame. And toxic shame is, I describe it as an impaired sense of self, where you feel and this is at a deep subconscious self-identity core level. It's not a conscious thing. When you feel that you're not smart enough, you're not pretty enough, you're not worthy enough, you're less than human. And I think John Bradshaw wrote a great book called Healing the Shame That Binds You, where he talks about all the different manifestations of toxic shame. Toxic shame is the root of addiction. For him, he was an addiction guy. Dr. James Gilligan, who was a forensic psychiatrist, I think at San Quentin for 25 years, wrote a book, Violence, Study of a National Epidemic. He said, I've never saw an act of violence that wasn't rooted in shame and humiliation. And it's a whole host of antisocial outcomes that, it doesn't, because you have toxic shame doesn't mean you're going to be a white supremacist. But if you're involved in that violent extremist kind of group, I can almost guarantee that you've got toxic shame.
And Tony, how does that concept of toxic shame, how does that mesh with privilege, like a sense of privilege? Like, because one might, or the white privilege that we were talking about earlier, because off the top of my head, I would see them as being separate, but are they?
Well, there's, with privilege comes a set of expectations, and if you don't meet certain expectations, if you fall short, that can be a source of shame. But again, we just put the privilege thing to a side, and it's a very important discussion. If you look at the United States right now, there's an epidemic of suicide, right? The way we deal with shame is one of two ways. We either export our shame, we put it onto somebody else, and that's through violence, abuse, emotional abuse. Murder is the ultimate externalized shame behavior, or we internalize it. When we have toxic shame, we spend an inordinate amount of time to either hide it from the world, in which way we I projected an image of someone that was powerful, somebody that was completely different, to hide so the world wouldn't see who I was, or we hide it from ourselves, and that's addiction, cutting, eating disorders. Suicide is the ultimate internalized shame response. But right now in the United States, there is an epidemic of suicide amongst white men. White men are the only demographic with a declining life expectancy. It's still 5 years more than a black man, than an African American man, and that's an issue that has to be addressed. But so there is an epidemic, and Princeton has done a couple of studies, great research on it, called death by despair. Right, so there's this despair, this shame that while there's the discussion of privilege, there's people living in the Rust Belt, dealing with opiate addiction and all of those types of things that don't feel that they're privileged, right? And they have privilege, but the reality is their life is in decline, and they're killing themselves in record numbers, and it's that despair, and it's across the West. It's got to do with globalization and exporting of jobs and all of that kind of stuff. But demagogues are able to tap into it. Brexit tapped into it.
Trump
tapped into it.
And
Bernie's tapping into it in a different way.
And Trump himself, I think he's somebody who, in my view, as he was starting his political career, started to see that there's a great sense of discontent and a base, not just the Republican Party, but a base of society that wasn't being addressed by CNN, MSNBC that we talked about before, that there's a whole level of society whose issues were not being championed, and he became the champion for the silent majority,
in much the way Bernie Sanders is too. He's tapping into the same sentiment.
Yeah,
right.
Just on the other side.
Just on the other side, and you've got Italy where populism on the you've got the there's the right wing populism and the left wing populism. I think populism is an essential part of democracy. I think. For me, it's like the check engine light coming on in your car, and when populism shows up, it's telling you there's something systemically wrong that needs to be addressed. And if the elites and the establishment ignore that, it keeps going until there's like an engine failure. But while populism almost never offers the right solutions, it often asks the right questions. And I think we have to pay attention to what's going on. To the underlying society that has caused them to reject the establishment and adopt someone who's offering them something different. It's because the reality of what they have is not great, and they're sort of upending that.
So many of the times also, because of these underlying issues within a nation, when you start to bring in immigrants from a different country, a different culture, or refugees, and it's very publicized, it's very obvious, even though in numbers they might be a few thousand, but just the image of it and what it could mean, how does that kind of stir the pot? How does, especially from the white nationalist perspective, what do they see when they see the news that, Trudeau's bringing in 26,000 refugees, given the context that we just talked about?
Well, I think for Canada, and this is the difference between Canada and Germany, and granted we're not walking distance from Syria, but Trudeau said, we're bringing in 50,000 Syrian refugees. Now, if you look at that as a percentage of the population, that's the same as Europe bringing in 650,000, if you're going to do a per capita basis. But they said, here's the plan. This is where they're going to go. This is the resources we're doing. And Canadians, for the most part, kind of went, okay. That's the...
Or not all Canadian, but a certain, at least during the height of it. And I think a lot of people forget the root of how all this happened was... in the aftermath on the war on terror, the war in Iraq, searching for weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist. So a country was more or less destroyed and destabilized, and certain power structures from the Ba'athist generals that were marginalized and kicked to the side took whatever military power and equipment and started to form their separate groups. And some became radicalized. Some used this radical version of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Daesh, their kind of destruction of kind of the norms of Iraq and then the destabilization of Syria. So it created this untenable environment which caused this millions of people to migrate to try and save themselves, just to save their lives, save their families, which is obviously a human desire to keep the family safe, keep yourself safe. And so because of that, this record number of migrants to try and come to Europe, and then as a byproduct to also come to the United States and Canada. But it's created this kind of xenophobia. Why are they coming? What are they doing? Like, a lot of people don't want to leave their homelands. They want to stay in their homes and their countries. But because of this historical aspect of war that caused all this to happen, it seemed like it was timed in the way that the war, the aftermath of the war, the Arab Spring in 2011, the discontent all across the board, and all of it seemed to culminate, whether the Arab Spring to the rise of the alt-right, it just seemed like a confluence of events kept fueling these kind of nationalistic and
populist.
Yeah, and I think Canada's response though was a lot tamer than what happened in Germany, right? I think Canada, I mean, there's always people that are against any immigration,
sure,
right? And there's always fear and mistrust of the other, whoever that is. But I think for the most part, Canadian society was okay. Let's do this. But Merkel said, 1 million people come on in. There was no plan, and the absence, and if there was one, it wasn't communicated to the people. So in the absence of a plan, you have uncertainty, and when you have uncertainty, you have fear, and when you have fear, you have people that exploit that fear to whip up sentiment like that. And I think that was a critical mistake that Merkel made. Is she didn't set the expectations for the German people. Canada had expectations. And I get that Germany's walking distance from Syria.
Yeah.
If you got a couple of months to spare,
yeah.
And Canada's over here separated by an ocean. But I think it was a very different approach in how it was communicated to the people, because it's not an insignificant number of people that Canadian took in on a per capita basis.
And with that, from your discussions and seeing the discussion forums when the waves of immigration would come specifically to Canada, but now we're finding obviously in the U.S. Immigration has been stopped for refugees for the most part, like no welcoming of refugees, as was the historical kind of culture of the United States accepting refugees around the world, and now that's stopped. Whereas Canada is still accepting refugees, but the United States has stopped, and Europe is still working to deal with the refugees that have come not only from the Middle East and Syria, and also you mentioned Italy before. They have a lot of migrants that are coming from Africa, and so I think
through Libya.
So because of that,
because the West took the second most affluent nation in Africa and
destabilized,
turned it into
turned it into a hellhole with open slave markets in the capital city.
Yeah, and then it becomes this situation where these, although they were totalitarian regimes, and there's no disputing that these weren't great regimes, the Gaddafi regime or Saddam Hussein.
Better than what they have now.
Yeah, exactly. People, I think, would rather have some stability rather than the chaos and the uncertainty and the kind of level of fearing for your life and your family's life. And because of that, these record numbers of migrants, because of the destruction of Libya, of Iraq, and people just want certainty. They want safety for their families, so they're fleeing. And because they're coming into Western countries, there's a fear of entrenched populations that, hey, we don't want them here.
Right, and that also comes on the sort of on the heels of the Great Recession, and I said in I think some interviews, back in the day, but I said, in a time of affluence, multiculturalism, it's all great, it's all wonderful, until you have to compete with your neighbor for a crust of bread in the street. Then it's all bets are off. Right, and when there's that sense of scarcity of resources, scarcity of opportunity, that comes on the heels of a Great Recession, that really that scarcity fuels the fire quite a bit as well.
And part of that issue, the economic issue in particular, like most economics say that immigration improves the economy.
Absolutely.
From a statistical perspective. So how come that is not always necessarily translated into an emotional understanding of that? Because the facts are very, very clear. Immigration improves economies wherever immigration happens.
Because the whole thing is not intellectually based; it's emotionally based, and fear is irrational.
Yeah,
it's not a logical thing. I mean, my daughter has has like a catastrophic fear of spiders.
And my wife too.
Yeah, I help them out the door so they can go hunt other bugs that I don't like. So it's, but it's it's in the mind. It's again, a lot of this stuff isn't intellectually driven, and people if you ever watch like a Trump rally or whatever, he's playing to emotions. He's not.
No, absolutely.
He's
completely
not.
to emotions.
He's not playing to the intellectual scholars in the room.
No.
And he's communicating to the people in the way that they can understand. He's not politically correct. He's not varnished. He's being his quote unquote authentic self, where he's basically maybe saying how he feels or what he feels the audience wants, and he does it very well. And in terms of the alt-right now, because hate-motivated crimes are on the rise all throughout Europe and North America. Recently, last week, 9 people were killed in Germany that were of Kurdish origin, migrants or refugees, and they were targeted because they were refugees or migrants, and the perpetrator was a German national who very rarely they give these gun permits, and he had no history of crime, no criminal record. He did have that gun license, and he used it on people that he viewed were a threat to Germany, and so these type of attacks are happening more and more frequently in the United States. Even with
Christchurch,
exactly.
We're coming up on the anniversary of that soon.
Yeah, and then with the Quebec shootings in January 29th. So all of these things, these hate-motivated attacks on refugees, of Muslims, of people of color, so these are increasing. They're not decreasing. And the rhetoric that's being spread and the leadership, it seems like a lot of the leadership in the alt-right is emboldened. People are more out in the open. It's no longer kind of closeted, where people are now feeling confident to express views that used to be under the table or not discussed publicly.
No, and I think we also have to be cognizant of the fact that while a lot of this stuff, a lot of these extreme events are happening at the fringe of society, what happens at the fringe is very much informed by what we tolerate in the middle, when we let little acts of intolerance go by. We actually, down the road, give greater permission to things happening at the fringe. And so it's really important that the leadership of the country and the leadership that we have to be as human beings in every moment of every day, and how we set the example around us of how to behave and how to treat other human beings, has to stand firm and not allow those little acts of intolerance go by, because it's almost like the broken window theory
Giuliani in New York,
of crime, and we have to fix all the little broken windows in the middle, as well as worry about what's happening at the end.
One interesting thing about that concept is how the simplest measures of that can have the hugest impact. One statistic that I came across was that for the majority of Canadians who dislike Islam and dislike Muslims, they don't even know a Muslim.
Of course not.
But they don't. They've never had any personal experience. They've never met one, never talked with one. But by just merely engaging with one on a one-to-one basis, the rate of the dislike for Islam dropped 50%, and nothing changed other than just talking to someone. So, like in your line of work, after you've gone through your journey, you've met more and more people, would you say there's real substance to that? Would you say that?
Absolutely. And I'm going to tell you this story. It was out of some of the work some of the other co-founders did at Life After Hate. And, we received a call from this guy, and he's an Iraqi-Afghan vet, and struggling. And he was like, I'm really angry at Muslims. I think he'd seen friends or colleagues blown up in battle and stuff like that, so he's quite traumatized by it, and he was starting to have ideations of harming the Muslim community, and
in the United States.
He didn't have a plan or anything yet, so it was right on the border for duty to report. But we said, can you hold on 24 hours? We'll come out and see you. And flew out to where he was at, and spent a weekend with him. And we got in touch with the local imam at the local Muslim center, the one that he was having ideations about. I said, and asked him if he had some time to meet with this guy, and And he said, well, I can give you 15 minutes, in the afternoon. And so, after our guys worked with this guy, they took him down to the local Muslim center, and 15 minutes turned into 2 hours. And at the end, he was hugging, he was crying, and is now very much involved with that Muslim community center, and they've become good friends ever since. And that's part of the strategy that we use with Life After Hate is to try and introduce people to the people that they once hated. And there's nothing more powerful than receiving compassion from someone who you don't feel you deserve it from, particularly if it's someone you have once dehumanized. And I just want to put a caveat of that. I'm not for a second saying that it's the responsibility of people of color and marginalized communities to go and hug a Nazi. It's not. But it is a tremendous gift, should you choose to give it.
And you're talking about Life After Hate, and just for those listening, if you could, you're a co-founder, if you could discuss the origin of it, and because it is, in your book, as you say, former white nationalists and white supremacists and alt-right that are focusing on making amends and really like the 12-step program in Alcoholics Anonymous to have a strategy to make amends and to build relationships and build community. So maybe talk about the history and some of the impact Life After Hate has had on
Sure.
society.
And over Christmas, I recently left Life After Hate to focus more on what's going on in here and sort of set up something similar in Canada. But they do great work, and I still completely support their mission. But it was formed by 5 former white supremacists and one sort of gang guy from Chicago in 2011, with the idea of helping people who were where we once were. And so many of us managed to find our way out of it on our own, stumbling through the wilderness. And we thought, I wish there was someone there to sort of guide me, out. I wish I had a guide. So the idea is to coach and mentor other people that want to leave and shepherd them out. And when we first got together, we were invited to the Summit Against Violent Extremism put on by Google Ideas in 2011. It was a website and stuff before then. And Google Ideas in Dublin, they had to do it in Dublin, brought together 50 former violent extremists from around the world. So there was some skinheads, neo-Nazis. That was, the 6 of us were there. There was Bloods, Crips, and MS-13 were there.
And those are African-American and South American gangs?
Yes, yeah. But there was Red Brigade, Baader Meinhof, Mujahideen. There was guys that had fought in Afghanistan against the Russians. There was Al-Shabaab. There was the IRA and the Ulster Volunteer Force, the Protestant nemesis. They all had to be working towards peace. Otherwise, it would have been crazy. But it was surreal. It really was a rabbi, a terrorist, and a skinhead walk into a bar. It made some tremendous friends and contacts. But we were blown away by the side conversations. Like, how did you get into that? And it was like, well, I was alone. I was, they offered me community and brotherhood and a sense of purpose, and these themes kept showing up over and over and over again. And when I asked them, well, how did you get out? It was one of 2 stories were the primary stories. One was the birth of a child, and I'm going to say anecdotally a female child.
And that's your story. That's how you saw the light, as it were. You saw your baby daughter in a lot of your interviews, and that was your catalyst to change.
Absolutely. And that the other one was receiving compassion from someone who we didn't feel we deserved it from, someone who we had dehumanized. And that's also in my story with
Dov Baron, the Jewish consultant that in terms of personal growth and development.
Yeah. I didn't know he was Jewish at the time, but that's a funny story. You have to read the book. He also wrote the foreword.
And both of those instances are manifestations of love.
Right. So, let's rewind the tape back to shame, right? And shame is the alienation of the self, right? And we become disconnected from our own humanity, right? And so, what compassion does is it's the rehumanizer, right? When we're compassionate with someone, we hold a mirror up to them and allow them to see their humanity reflected back at them when they can't see it on their own. What my children did for me was they looked at me as like this amazing, loving father provider. That's not who I saw when I looked into the mirror. The shame told me I was a terrible dad, and I was this and I was that. But I saw my humanity reflected back at me through their eyes. And compassion is the antidote to shame. Shame, we're disconnected and dehumanized. I believe that the level to which we dehumanize other human beings is a mere reflection of our own internal disconnection and dehumanization. And for me, the way out was through Dov, through my children, through other things. They helped rehumanize me. And the more I could connect to my own humanity, the more I could see the humanity in other people. So when someone comes and you have this positive impact from someone you've dehumanized, and they show you compassion, and that person treats them as a human being, then they can start to reconnect. The one thing I wrote in the book about Dov is like, if he can love me, certainly I can learn to love myself, right? If this Jewish guy can learn me, the Holocaust denier, who had once advocated for the annihilation of him and his people, then certainly I could love me. And that's what compassion is.
And I'm looking at your book, and I'm looking at all the people that have written testimonials for you. And we've got Daisy Khan, who's from the Women's Islamic Initiative for Spirituality and Equality. We've got Jonathan Greenblatt from the Anti-Defamation League. We've got Gurpreet Singh, founder of Radical Desi, which is an East Indian group here in Vancouver. And so we've got all these different races and religion that you were formerly against, and now here are these same folks coming out for you to give support to the work that you're doing to heal people from hatred and racism. So it's a testament to your change to go from one complete extreme to another complete extreme, where now you're actually intimate in terms of your friendships and relationships with people you used to hate.
Yeah, it's the transformation from shame to compassion. It's the transformation from dehumanized to humanized, and that's the journey. That's the journey we as human beings that we all have to struggle with. It's the human condition.
And so, Tony, we're nearing the end of our interview for today. Maybe if you can just leave us with a couple words on your suggestions for both people who might find themselves in states of extremism currently, white supremacists in particular, and also for new immigrants, refugees. How can they understand and appreciate the cultural milieu of Canada when they come here? And like, what can both sides do to spread that love?
Well, I think for people that are caught up in the world of hate, you can reach out to me at thecureforhate.com, or you can reach out to Life After Hate at lifeafterhate.org. For new immigrant communities, I think, and I would say this, to anyone, because I think, not just new immigrants, but I think we have to, even to people that are encountering new immigrants, we have to be curious, and we have to suspend whatever judgment we have. And when we can approach and engage with people with curiosity and non-judgment, that's when we can really get to know who those people are. And I think it's important for, I think, the immigrant community to do that. So, the rest of society is not as scary, because it can be a two-way street. And I think it's preserving that curiosity and non-judgment, and we definitely have to do that to make those communities feel more welcome. But I think it's important, too, that they don't let their own fears and biases keep them closed off from society. And I think if both sides can engage with each other with that curiosity and non-judgment, I think magic happens.
I'll tell you something interesting. So yes, the last interview we did was with a young Syrian girl. Her name was Hiba. And when her family first came to Vancouver, they were actually shocked by a lot of what they were seeing, especially like the homeless situation we have in Vancouver. And this kind of, cultural shock, it almost made them want to leave immediately, right? But luckily they were curious. Luckily they did continue to explore and engage with society. And I think what you're saying, it does make a lot of sense that when you get to learn more about the other side, when you get to learn more about people, it opens doors. Like, do you have any examples, like, for how yourself personally that curiosity moved you from one state of being to another?
For me, it was because I was so isolated. What opened that up a lot for me was actually having curiosity and non-judgment towards myself. Self-compassion. And that was, the path I went down with Dov, helping me on that journey. And the more I could connect to myself, the more I could connect to others. And I struggled with that for the longest time. And I think a lot of people do struggle with that self-forgiveness, self-compassion, and being curious and non-judgment about ourselves. Like, it's not just out there. I think we have to be curious and non-judgmental about...
Which is sometimes the hardest thing to do.
Right. And given the history of what I had done, and the people that I had hurt and the things that I had said, that was a really difficult thing for me. And I remember reading, I think it was the Dalai Lama, wrote, the more I can have compassion and forgiveness for myself, the more I diminish my capacity to do harm in the world. And it was through that understanding that I don't do it for me. I do it for the people around me. The more I can, and it takes me to a thing a part in the book where I talk about radical compassion. And, empathy is feeling what another person's feeling, and identifying with what they're feeling. Compassion is taking action to eliminate or reduce what they're feeling. So it's empathy plus action equals compassion. Radical compassion has 3 components to it. Number 1, our practice of compassion must take us outside our comfort zone. And I think a lot of the problems we have in our society today aren't going to be solved from our comfort zone, and we have to accept that. Number 2, radical compassion involves a component of social activism. So it's not just alleviating the suffering of another human being. It's also social action to change the environment which is contributing to or supporting the suffering. And 3, and it's the most radical act I think a human being can do, if we want to give compassion to other people, we have to mine it from within ourselves. If we have compassion for everybody else but not ourselves, that's not compassion, that's ego. If we have compassion for ourselves and nobody else, that's narcissism.
Wow.
And if we have the 2 in balance, then it's truly a wonderful thing.
And that will help in not just Canadian society, which, as you said, is in many respects better off than a lot of, say, European, like what's going on in Germany. I've known a lot of Germans in my life, and I've never felt them to be have a lack of compassion, but maybe the idea of a radical sense of compassion is what's going to help heal a lot of these kind of burning situations around the world. Like, if you look across the globe, populism is on the rise almost virtually everywhere. Everywhere it's increasing. And for refugees, and there's 70 million, by the way, 70 million refugees in the world today. That's not an inconsequential number. It's almost double Canadian population, plus 10 million,
yeah,
something like that. For these folks, as they're leaving their countries brought about by war, or recently a lot of it's climate change. So you have millions and millions of people who are in both need of compassion, but also they're entering environments where, because of the situation economically, because of the situation socially, maybe their presence helps as a catalyst to destabilize something. Have you seen something like that amongst like the threads of like thinking in the alt-right or in white supremacist theories, or is it just hate? Is it just hate, or is it like, do they have an argument against these things?
Well, there's always a pseudo-intellectual justification. It's not just hate, but the they have to try and rationalize the hate because they're, like I said, they're disconnected from their humanity. They're in this place of ego. When the ego is untethered from the heart, it goes to strange places. For your listeners, I don't think the ego should ever be driving the bus.
Yeah.
The heart should drive the bus, and the ego can chirp from the back seat all at once. That's fine, but the ego should never drive the bus.
Because otherwise, then you'll just be responding in almost like instinctive nature. Like if you're hungry, you'll just go and take someone's sandwich, kind of thing, as opposed to
exactly,
which is very dangerous in modern societies where we have systems of law, we have systems of organization to help against that. And one thing I really want to say, and I appreciate this, is how upfront you are about the need for compassion. Because many people, they would just pay lip service to it, but they would not go and write a whole book about it. So what was the cause for the book? Like, what inspired you to write that?
Countless people telling me, when are you going to write a book? No. But I think the journey, and I thought of writing a book 10 years ago, but I really think it would have just been like many of the other books written about former white supremacists or by former white supremacists. I was in this thing and I got out. Mm-hmm. But I think in this book I've taken it a huge step where I explore forgiveness, compassion, atonement, making amends, going back to the communities that I've once harmed in reconciliation and trying to make amends. And a lot of those stories of me doing that's the back half of the book, and I wouldn't have been able to write that if I'd wrote it 10 years ago because it didn't exist. But I think now the time is right, and I think it's a message that the world needs to hear because we're not in a good place right now.
No, and as you said earlier, often recessions and economic challenges are what bring down people's tolerance and increase people's aggravation towards a lot of these, and many economists assume that we're going into a even greater recession within the next couple years. So for our listeners, what do you suggest, like as a practical manifestation of compassion, to kind of prepare our societies for any economic downturn? Right.
So and there's a piece to compassion that we haven't discussed, and that's on its own. There's a perception that compassion is weak or forgiveness is weak. But compassion, when accompanied by healthy boundaries and consequences, has to be accompanied by healthy boundaries and consequences, becomes powerful. If I forgive you and you slap me in the head, and then I forgive you and you slap me in the head, and then I forgive you and you slap me in the head, that's not forgiveness, right? That's me allowing abuse. But when we accompany it with healthy boundaries and consequences, it's a powerful thing. And think of, and I was thinking this walking to meet you guys this morning, and it's like the Shaolin monks who were into meditation and compassion, but their temples kept getting robbed by bandits. So they developed kung fu and this, magnificent martial arts where that is like the embodiment of compassion with healthy boundaries and consequences. Right? You don't mess with us. You're not taking our stuff, but just leave us to meditate and be compassionate. And when the two are together, it's a remarkable thing.
And I think what you said earlier, it's somebody has to take a step, and especially communities that don't necessarily interact with one another. And if somebody legitimately has some sort of gripe or agitation because of the way the news media and how a lot of people consume their news via the internet, and so certain negative sentiments keep repeating over and over again, and certain inflammatory speakers online can just agitate a large number of people to prompt them to do something and to take that first step to meet people.
That's a great point, and I go back to Gandhi: be the change you wish to see. And the book is about hope. I'm hopeful. I'm not. Is it going to be easy together? No, it's not going to be easy, and everybody has a role to play. If we wait for a political solution or someone come in on a white horse and make it all go away, that's not going to happen. It's who we decide to be in every moment of every day is going to make the difference. It's millions and millions and millions of individual actions, which is going, because as human beings, we get to, through our action, inspire people to act one way or the other. And there's a lot of people inspiring people to act towards dehumanization. But we have the ability to inspire them to act in a different way, and don't wait for contact to be made. Take the first step. Take the first step with curiosity, non-judgment, and create the welcoming environment, create the interactions that happen. One of the things I've learned is I spent 15 years trying to change the world out there, to make me feel better. And what I've learned is I have more power to change the world out there if I change the world of inside me. If I change who I am in the world, I have more. I've learned by doing that, I've had more ability to influence the world than when I was solely focused my energies externally on trying to change the world. And I think that's that internal, that radical compassion piece. And I think if we change who we are in the world and be that example to show, because some people, they just don't know what to do. But leaders go first. Leaders go first. And when two groups of people are looking at each other, should I talk? Should I talk? Should someone go
almost
first?
like kids at a dance or something like that.
Yeah, we're all standing around and, step up and ask someone to dance with curiosity, non-judgment, and a whole lot of fear.
And it's interesting because the other looks different. So, some observant Muslims may have beards or wear the headscarf, and there's a kind of a symbolism attached to that through the media aspect. Like the last interview with the young girl from Syria, she said, wow, Canada is a great country. There's no racism. And then one incident happened in her high school where she's walking and she does wear the headscarf, and a guy made a comment, it looks like there's a terrorist here. So it's like a term like that, like she's when you hear her story, it's a circumstance that she didn't want to be a refugee. She came from a good life in Syria, and then to be called something that you're not, and that's such a loaded term. Like a terrorist means somebody who perpetrates a crazy act of violence on people without any seeming reason. So it becomes like that kind of comment is hurtful, but those that have those sentiments to be like, hey, you know what, maybe I should meet some of these folks, these Syrian refugees, and kind of get a sense of their stories. And part of the goal of this podcast and to have you on is to see multiple perspectives, to understand it from everyone's eyes, because when you're in your own story, you can't see the other person's story. So it's kind of like almost like a therapeutic way to look at everyone's perspective, so there's a better way of understanding.
Well, and here's a really cool thing too, and I challenge people to do that. You could do it with random acts of kindness, but if you go and take that initiative and connect with that human being, and it may be outside your comfort zone, but you go in with the curiosity and the non-judgment, and you meet this really cool person, you feel really good afterwards, right? We're all looking for different distractions to make us feel good. I remember I was at a gas station down at 16th and McDonald, and there was an old Lebanese guy. He was probably 70, working there, and he'd worked at another gas station I lived across the street from, and his name was Jeff. And I'm in my car on going to work, and I'm busy on the phone, so I went to the full serve, and he filled my car with gas, and then I didn't ask for it. He came and brought me a coffee. Like, that's pretty cool. Like, that's above and beyond the service. And I got out of the car, and I said, because we bumped into each other before in the gas station. I said, "You're a good man, Jeff." And I pointed to my eyes and I pointed to his eyes, and I said, "I see you. I see you. You're a good man." And I tucked a $20 bill in his pocket. He starts tearing up. Just to be seen, just to be acknowledged, and I start tearing up just at the whole emotion of that whole day. I tear up now just thinking about it. I spent these moments where we just eye gazed and had this connection, and it was like 3 minutes. And then I went on with my day, and he went on with his day. But I tell you what, I felt so good from that interaction for the rest of the day. It was the best $20 I ever spent. Like, if you just pay $20 and you can have this magnificent feeling whole day, like, that's better than drugs.
And what's amazing about it
Not that I do drugs, but
what's amazing about it is that you were the complete violent antithesis to compassion, to really go to harm people physically, harm their places of worship, and now I would say you count, like, we're friends, like,
absolutely.
We have, and your relationship.
We've gone through walks in the woods, discussing all things philosophical.
Exactly, and now your circle of friends is wider and richer.
Absolutely.
Because you decided to, hey, I'm going to reach out to the other side, who I think is the other side, and now they're not the other side. We're all on the same side. So it seems like from one complete extreme of violent hate, not just comments on the internet, like actual violent hate, to becoming friends and working towards bridging communities together, which is going from one complete extreme to the other, which is an amazing transformative journey.
Yeah, because before I was completely disconnected, and now I'm connected. I'm connected to everything and everyone, and it's one of the best definitions of sin that I've ever heard. Is any thought or deed which separates you from yourself, your family, society, or from God. So it could be, is drinking 2 beers might connect me. Drinking 7 beers is going to disconnect me. So it becomes like this little guy thing. Is what I'm about to do going to create connection or disconnection? And where I can, I try to choose connection. And I think it's a really simple way. And if you take that concept a little bit further, good is total connection. Evil is total disconnection. It's the complete absence of connection. That's how a corporation can be evil, when it operates without connection to the community, to the environment, to everything that's going on. So for me, good and evil are all about being either totally connected or totally disconnected, or the million shades of gray in between.
Yeah.
And to break bread, like that conference, the Google Ideation Conference, that brought all these extremist groups together to sit with one another, to eat with one another, to talk with one another, and realize, hey, they're not very different from me.
Yeah.
No, I mean, when you have the Irish Republican Army, which is the Catholic paramilitary group in Northern Ireland, and you have the Ulster Volunteer Force, which is their Protestant enemies, and guys from the two groups go together to schools, talking to young people. It can happen. It works, and people can come together, and it's an incredible transformation, but it's proof that it's possible. And I think we have to have faith in humanity. And if we know that it's possible, the next step is, let me try. We have to try to make it happen. It doesn't happen on its own.
And this term, why do they hate us? And then on the other side, with refugees and people from other countries that are feeling hate. So the answer to why did they hate us could be, well, let's get to know one another. Let's talk with one another. Let's break bread with each other. So instead of asking these questions, just come out and meet with a cross section from with our relationship and our friendship, and people from other stratas of society, to sit with them, talk with them, eat with them, and the perspectives will change forever.
Yeah. And Tark knows that I'm a huge fan of food diplomacy. Like, I believe in that. Like 100%, I'm down for that.
So now, Tony, we're kind of coming to this cathartic conclusion of how refugees, everyone here, like our forefathers, were all refugees to Canada and the United States, and so
I'm a refugee. No, not a refugee, but an immigrant.
Exactly, and everyone has always felt that sense of being different, whatever it was, being maybe too white, too black, too Jewish, too Muslim, too Christian, whatever it is. Everyone
that disconnect
has this feeling that maybe somehow people are looking at me different. I'm different from others, and I would say everyone has that kind of fear. Everyone has that thing that, hey, I'm different. Maybe people don't like me because I'm different for whatever reason. And so by this forum, and thank you for your time for coming to sit with us. And I know you're going to Australia today, so your time is tight. And thank you for coming and to kind of share your perspective, because I would say a lot of immigrants and refugees would like to hear your perspective, this perspective, to really understand better as to why people are thinking this way and what we can do as a strategy. Just let's take that first step. Let's meet people that may have a different opposing view and break bread, have a conversation, buy somebody a cup of coffee, and then hopefully somebody's life can change.
Beautiful.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you so much. If you have any questions related to the Refugee Portal podcast, are interested in sponsorships, interviews, or ideas, please feel free to get in touch with us at refugeeportal.org or email us at info@refugeeportal.org.